So pleased to welcome Neely Tucker to discuss his new novel, The Ways of the Dead, a neatly plotted noir that is getting rave reviews and was already named one of the summer's best by the Washingtonian, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the Miami Herald. With finely drawn, nuanced characters, this is a timely book that takes on the hot button issues of race and class in D.C. in 1999. The novel's protagonist, Sully Carter, is a D.C. beat reporter whose work in war zones has taught him there's rarely one side to a story and that it takes more than a brave face to get out of a dangerous situation. Tucker presumably knows this well himself. He's worked as a reporter for the last 25 years and has reported from more than 20 countries and 24 of these United States. He now works at the Washington Post covering a wide variety of topics. This is his second book and first novel. His memoir, Love in the Driest Season, was critically acclaimed and named one of the top 25 books of that year by Publishers Weekly. Will you please join me in welcoming Neely Tucker?
Hi, I am officially frightened. I thought they had entrance standards in this place, and yet looking out here I see a number of reprobates, delinquents, and outright convicts who somehow managed to come in. So welcome everybody, and I hope your parole officer doesn't know you're here. I am just finishing up what we call the rolling Yabba review. Yabba is a nonsense word that a friend of mine, Connie Ogle, insisted that I said to her on, we have this one football night a year where all of my friends come in and we watch SEC football, and Connie swears that on the night before the games, I looked at her and said, trying to say something else, Yabba. Hence the rolling Yabba review. So I want to thank everybody at Politics Prose for having me here. I've just finished up a week of basically Viking, my wonderful publisher, sending me all over the country to, as near as I can tell, some of the greatest bookstores in the United States. One More Page out in Arlington, and Books and Books in Miami, Poison Pen in Phoenix, Murder by the Book in Houston, Book People in Austin, Tattered Cover in Denver, and last night out at Copperfields in San Mateos. And now I'm back here. I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning, San Francisco time. So I'm going to attribute, any sort of nonsense I say to that, whether it's true or not. That's what I'm going with. And as many of you in this room know, I grew up in Mississippi. I am actually, God help me, 7th generation Mississippian. And always thought of myself as a storyteller. I never really thought of myself as a journalist. As God knows, most of the people in this room have never thought of me as a journalist either. And the way to tell a story, as anybody knows, starts once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a mean little book about a mean little town. This is the mean little book, and this is the mean little town. Washington, again, is there. I'm used to doing this on the road, so as everybody here knows, Washington is actually a very small place. It's just 69 square miles, most of it between two rivers with a little bit over here. And it is home to some of the most powerful people in the United States, some of the most dispossessed, and some of the most violent. And sometimes those groups run into each other. And in fact, that is just what happens in the first pages of this book, which is based on a true story. I'll get to that in just a minute. But in the first pages of this book, a rich white judge's daughter, Sarah Reese, goes to a dance class at, this is set in 1999, when the city looked a lot different than it does now. And she goes to a dance class at right up on Georgia Avenue at New Hampshire, Petworth Parkview, which was a pretty rough neighborhood. And she leaves her dance class to go over to a corner market to get something that she shouldn't have been getting. She winds up with her throat cut in an alley. One of Dutch Leonard's rules of writing fiction was to never say all hell breaks loose. So of course I am honor bound to say, after this, all hell breaks loose. And one of the reporters, there is a nameless paper. It's always referred to as the paper in Washington, D.C. It has no name and it never will. This is the first book in a series, and your tour guide through this and all other books in this series is a guy named Sully Carter. He is a reporter at said paper. He is filled with equal parts bourbon and attitude. And It's a real stretch for me to write. Fiction, people, the power of it's amazing. And this is a little short bit about the first time you will meet Sully Carter. Shockingly, it's in a bar. Sully Carter, on his third Basil Hayden's on the rocks, waterback, felt the October air blow into the bar through an open window near his booth. He closed his eyes for a second. It felt that good, like a kiss from home. His white linen shirt, freshly pressed at the beginning of the day, was wrinkled and untucked from his jeans. The sleeves were rolled up at the cuffs, and he hadn't bothered with a razor, it being a Friday. He was sitting in the back corner of Stoney's, the Ducati racing jacket slung over the seat on the booth, the helmet beneath it. He felt good enough to punch somebody. He rattled the ice in his glass, sipped, and felt the slight and lovely sting of bourbon on the tip of the tongue. Sneaking another glance at the bar, he caught a glimpse of Dusty, still working, taking orders next to Dmitri, the other bartender, that guy from the Ukraine. She didn't see him look this time, but she had earlier, so maybe that could count as flirting or foreplay or something. Lean as a light pole, Sully spoke in a slight rasp, a trace of Louisiana accent, more centered on the Irish-German sections of New Orleans, but it took an ear. He was taller than most people, but because he tended to lean back on his left leg, it wasn't always apparent. The shrapnel blast he had taken while covering the Bosnian War, the hot metal that had eaten up his right knee, broken 3 ribs, and sliced open his left cheek, that bitch had tattooed its signature across his face and torso, too. There were horizontal scars down his cheek, with tiny little welts around both eyes. There was a long horizontal scar at the top of his forehead, but it was mostly concealed by the shock of black hair that fell slightly over it. He had twin scars that ran down his right side like a short set of railroad tracks, and the skin on his right knee, it looked like it had been put together by Dolly during a hangover. The unusual gait, the scars, the posture, the distant manner, it all combined to create a menacing air of someone who cared a little less about his future than the people around him cared about theirs. Sully, this book is set in 1999, which was the last of the glory days, I submit, of the American newspaper. It was back in the day when the Sunday paper landed on your doorstep and it made a percussive whoomp. Nowadays it makes a poop. And that's the way it is. That's the way things are going. It's not coming back, right? It's just how it is. But these were and I was very conscious of wanting to write about this, that this was the days when newspapers, a big city metropolitan daily, really did dictate what the news of the day was. It said what happened, and that was it. And the Sunday paper was God. It meant what happened. When a big metro daily put its stamp on an event, that is what happened. Any other media organization certainly read that, and they had to bounce their accounts off of that. Sully Carter, this reporter, is from, I don't know if anybody like this ever actually existed, but he's from sort of this romanticized era of back in the day when a reporter, a GA reporter, was sort of a rascal. College training wasn't necessary, actually. This guy, he might have been busting broncs out in Wyoming. Probably drove a truck down in Texas for a while, an oil rig. Tended bar somewhere. And there was an incident down in Florida that nobody ever really talked about anymore. And, you know, he cursed like a sailor. He drank like a fish. Aye, but on deadline, he wrote like an angel. That is, like I said, I don't know that anybody like this ever existed. But if you're as old as me and you grew up in newspapers, that's who you thought you kind of should have been, right? And for a guy like Sully, who has such amount of attitude, working at a big metro daily is a little bit of a problem. Sully, as you heard, got blown up in Bosnia. He's very cynical, and he has reasons to be. And he has a very particular idea that homicide gives insights into the way the rest of the country lives. And he's also pretty adept at being on deadline and knowing how the game of the big city, big time story of the day works, right? So here's another short little bit. If you've never been on deadline before, some of you have. Here's what it's like. Um, he's writing the second day story, right? The first day story's been written about the judge's daughter getting killed, and we're going to come up on the second day lead. And here's Sully at his desk. But the main feature of his space was the hand-sketched homicide map of the city, his pride and possibly his joy. It was a poster-sized grid, about 36 inches wide and 50 inches tall, marked off by the 7 police districts, with a few major roads indicated, and it was his oracle of Washington. It was his manner of understanding the living by studying the ways of the dead, a habit so natural to him after covering years of war and violent conflict that it was no longer a conscious thought. If you wanted to understand any animal, he would tell college classes, then you have to understand the behavior that made them unique. And what made human beings unique among animals were the prefrontal cortex, the opposing thumb, the well-developed voice box, and the propensity to torture and kill other members of their species. When students sometimes objected to this as morbid or sought to invoke deities and religious perspectives, Sully would say that he had yet to see evidence of any deity, but any textbook offered 3,000 years or so of recorded history to back up his thoughts on humanity. Even if you believe the Bible is literally true, he would say, when the population of the planet was 4, Cain killed Abel, reducing it to 3. Homicide is not an aberration. It is the norm. It is part of who we are. Sullivan, God, I'm glad to see you, a voice called out, startling him. Melissa Baird, the Metro editor, was smiling, closing on him like a fast hawk on a slow rabbit. RJ is Sully's editor. RJ tells me you've got a beautiful piece on this neighborhood, just really beautiful. She was wearing her shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, her pressed jeans and an open-collared shirt, her idea of a casual Saturday. Had an air that all but screamed masters in fucking journalism from Columbia, born on third base in Westchester. Social climber, vertical blur at a paper that idolized the Ivy League and East Coast wankerdom. He swiveled in his chair, eyes darting to a clock posted on a beam behind her. It was nearly 5, front page meeting starting in 15. Thank God you got something so eloquent, she was saying. Nothing happened on the investigation today. They're still looking for the 3 guys in the store. She came into his cubicle and made a slight hop to sit on the edge of his desk, her newsroom trademark. Hunter's sources on cops zipped up tight, she continued. Pert. She was just so damn pert. The feds aren't returning calls. The Reese family is sequestered out in McLean. We'll put the investigation on the front page. We got to, right? But we're looking thin. Your piece is saving us. The art's already filed. Have you seen it? Early morning mist in an alley, looking across Georgia at the store where the girl was murdered. A couple of storefronts, a guy in ragged pants and a shirt. RJ saw it and said it was just the kind of atmosphere you got. RJ is the kind man, he said. He said something about Charles Bukowski poetry. Sully recognized the drill, and he recognized Melissa's skill at it. She was pumping him up while letting him know the pressure she, and by extension he, was under. And he recognized, without telling him what to write, she was telling him exactly what to write. Well, a piece like this, he said, thinking of something to bullshit her with, I think we just tell people what it feels like on the block down there. We tell them what the beer delivery guy is talking about while he's loading up a dolly, and you know what song is thumping out of a car at the light. We tell them what the bathroom in the strip club just down the street smells like. We tell them about the elementary school, swing sets in the rain, needles in the playground grass from the Friday night junkies, and that the people who live here, the people in Left Behind America, they're the ones who were least interested in the murder story, that's, horrifying the rest of the nation's capital. Perfect, she said. Golden. Never mind a leave for the 5 o'clock. Just go ahead and write in a public basket so we can peek in, okay? Helps headline guys. Move a final by 7. Sully nodded. Sure, yeah. Melissa popped her hands together and got off the desk, starting to back away. Pep talk done. That bit about the people there being the least interested in the murder that's fascinating the rest of the city? Scratch that. Can make it the rest of the country. This thing is all over the networks, the cables. The Beeb just did 8 minutes. She nodded, as if that were information he really needed right now, turned and walked away. Everything but a spring in her step. He put his pen in his mouth, typed in a slug for the story, Princeton Place, and not 20 seconds later felt the bulbs of sweat start pushing through the pores in the small of his back, under his arms, on his palms. Why couldn't you drink in the newsroom anymore? What was wrong with that? Sully, as you might gather, is going to have problems going forward. This isn't entirely paranoia on his part. Because if you do this long enough, when you deal with a high-profile event, when somebody's dead, somebody important who's dead, and all hell is breaking loose, everybody you talk to has a vested reason in lying to you, and they do. Sometimes they want to tell you the truth, they just don't know all of it, and they talk too much, so they wind up saying things that aren't true. Sometimes they'll tell you 70% that's true and 30% that's BS, and sometimes it's 37 the other way. And sometimes they don't tell you anything that's true at all, but they're very convincing. And this is where you wind up with a difference. Any reporter knows between what you think and what you know and what you know and what you can print. And that is a very dangerous place to live. So not only, if you only had to deal with newsroom politics, that would be one thing. But you have to be able to deal, as Sully does, with everybody out on the street. This means you have to be able to deal with federal judges. You have to deal with the people that they put in jail. You have to deal with people who like you. You have to deal with people who hate you. And you have to be able to always have this sense of who's telling you the truth and who's not. This is a short bit of that I like a lot, of when Sully is dealing with a cop. The numbers from this are real. There is a femme fatale in the book Who Goes Missing, a gorgeous Howard University student named Noelle Pittman. And as you will see in here, she went missing and hasn't been seen since. She is also known, one of the last things she did before she went missing, to have posed for some very erotic photographs, which have made their way around the police department, whether they should have or not. Sully wants to talk to a cop named Rudy Jeffries. We will hear more about Rudy Jeffries in just a minute. But Rudy Jeffries is a cop. Sully doesn't go by talking to, as you may have gathered, Sully's not the guy who's going to call the PR rep for the police department and tell him who he'd like to talk to. He just goes and talks to people, right? And that gets him in trouble. And he has a very angry confrontation with a sergeant out on the desk to get back to see the head of the missing persons office. This is when it starts. He just gets past the sergeant. He walks in Rudy Jeffries' office, and he says, I thought I'd come by and flirt with my girlfriend out there. What's her name out there? Charisse? Rudy said. No, Charisse don't care for your kind. Which my kind are we talking about? Reporters, but now that I think about it, she probably don't care for white people too much neither. Pity. Well, Noelle Pittman. Yes. You ever see the pictures? They are legend, brother. You guys chasing it as a homicide? Go ask homicide. Well, Sully said it started off as a missing persons. Out there in 4D, yeah. The homicide case did, Sully said. But I'm talking about when it was just a missing persons thing. Don't y'all track missing adults citywide out of this office? Used to, Rudy said. But in that reorg the chief loved so much, he moved all the missing person cases out to each ward last year when he transferred homicide out of Central Command. Oh, shit. Yeah, baby. The way it is now, the 7 wards, they're supposed to report their numbers into us, but work the cases themselves. The adult cases I'm talking, the kids, citywide, we still do that here. This sounds sort of fucked up. It sort of is. So even though Pittman started out as a missing person, an adult, you guys didn't do anything with it down here out of headquarters. Goodness, you're a bright boy. The name Lana Escobar ring a bell? Rudy paused. Last year, yeah. I was still in Vice. She turned up dead out there at Parkview. So was she, as they say, known to the Vice squad? You'd have to call over there for the Rolodex. It wasn't a big enough name for me to know about, I can tell you that. I just remember you did a little squib on her in the paper. Again, this is when the chief started moving shit around. I was leaving Vice, people leaving downtown, homicide and major crimes and all that out to the wards. Well, but her family says that they filed a missing persons report. Bully for them. I mean, no, when they reported her missing, that's when they found out she was a Jane Doe down at the morgue. I am grieving for them still, Rudy said. It bother you, Sully said, that Noel Pittman, once a missing person, turns up in the basement of the 700 of Princeton Place, and Lana Escobar, once a missing person, turns up on the outfield grass at Parkview Rec Center, which is also in the 700 of Princeton, and that they went missing within about 6 months of each other? That's the central problem to this case, which is based on an actual series of homicides in D.C. from about 3.5 years, from about 94 to 1999. The Parkview neighborhood, again, right up there south of, you guys know where this is, New Hampshire, Georgia. The neighborhood, the housing stock, mostly built in the 1920s, originally Greek, Jewish, Italian immigrants. By the 1950s or so, it was mostly black. By the 60s, it was entirely so. It was a very nice neighborhood. Did you guys see The Butler? Lee Daniels, The Butler? The Butler lived 1 block over from Princeton Place. So this is a nice neighborhood of older adults who, mowed their yard with scissors, and they fertilized the azaleas and they swept the sidewalks. However, when you throw in crack cocaine, some devolution of the city, by the late 1980s, early 90s, that very nice house is next to a crack squat. And you had in this neighborhood a number of women who really did go missing. And the tragedy of this case was that when they were gone for a day or two, nobody really noticed. And the perp in this case, Darrell Donnell Turner, who was now serving life without prison, and down in Beaumont he is right now, raped and strangled his victims. A number of them were known to do narcotics. Some of them did prostitution to fund that, very low level stuff. And so when police finally recovered the bodies, they didn't have a gunshot in their head, right? There was no knife wound. And if they recovered semen, well, they had been working as prostitutes. None of this really registered as a screaming homicide. Plus, D.C. at this time was the homicide capital of the United States. There was a new body coming about every 24 hours. So it was very easy for all of this to go missing. And there really was a reporter from, in this case, the Washington Post, who had been a former foreign correspondent, who was reporting on this area, who first got the idea that perhaps a serial killer was at work, who really did crawl around beneath the floorboards of the houses. He really did go into the strip club that you heard about down the street. And he really did put a front story on the front page of the Washington Post that it looks like there's a serial killer at work. And the police really did get pissed off about that. His name was not Neely Tucker. His name was Gabe Escobar, who was, as many of you in this room know, he's now the managing editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I'll leave up here, if you guys are interested, you can Google it. I didn't know Gabe had done any of that stuff, right? I was very clear about when I was writing this book that I wanted it to be about a situation, right? I didn't want to take any individual names, any individual cases, and I didn't want, because when you do a lot of reporting, sometimes that just seeps into the back of your mind. And I wrote this book over about a 3.5 year period, and I didn't want any of that to seep in. I really do have enough respect for victims' families that they wouldn't read something in the paper that they might think represented one of their victims. So I didn't know too much about it. I knew the general idea. I had covered the first few cases when Turner came into court in D.C. Superior Court when I was there. And, like most serial killers, I was struck when I saw him, at the difference between the banality of his appearance and the brutality of his crimes. Human monsters, this is one of the geniuses about human beings. The monsters don't look any different. You can't tell them apart. And I was always intrigued in writing about that. And Turner was eventually, like I say, he was eventually arrested, convicted. He lived right there on the block. He was hiding in plain sight. And he's now serving 2 life sentences in Texas. But the last thing I'll read you, this is a very short bit, and then we have some special guests I'll recognize. And then you guys can yak at me for a few minutes. But there's a question that I had in this book, but that Sully will deal with through all of these about, sort of I guess now called like post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's what does all this violence do to you, right? What does it do to the psyche? What does it do to your soul? When you want to be finished with it, it is not necessarily finished with you. Um, and there's a scene in the book where Sully and a prosecutor named Ava Harris are discussing this. And it's very short, I think, and this is the last thing I'll read and we're done. I think the only setup you need to know is that Nadia, who I mentioned, used to be Sully's girlfriend in Bosnia. And Sully struggled. What Sully is a man basically doing is a decent enough sort, attitude and authority problems notwithstanding, but what he's trying to do is find a reason to believe. And as the series goes forward, that is essentially what it's about, is can you, when you deal with so much violence, still find a reason to believe? Sully and Eva are in Stoney's talking. You ever get tired of all this? He asked, finally breaking her gaze, gesturing in the air with his glass a roll of the wrist. This? Eva said. Yeah, this. All this shit. The assholes and the shooters and the half-assed cops and the coke and the ganja and the general lack of intelligence or productive thought. And every goddamn day, more hustles, more stiffs, more fix, more rapes, more robberies. Well, she said, we operate in the goddamn margins, he said. I don't know about that, she said. I think it means something. It almost goes to the eternal. Jesus, H. No. Listen, sometimes I don't think my decedents are even really all that dead. Sometimes it seems like they're right there in the next room. Are they going to come around the corner and their mom or dad or their cousin or girlfriend, whoever, will go, oh, hey, sorry, there he is now. Like it was all a bad dream, the time they got that call, the police. Huh, he said. I can hear them talk at night sometimes, you know. They talk and talk, but it's not like anything you can understand. It's like a conversation in the next room. Mumbles, phrases, nothing distinct. Then I fall asleep. She paused. Sully was looking at his drink. Hey you, she said. Any of this make sense? You know what I mean? Sully Carter looked out of the front entrance of the saloon. The twin doors flung open, a little of the last light of day falling inside on the floor, making a skewed rectangle. Leaves blew up on the street, and one fluttered upward in a lazy, looping circle. And then it came sailing downward, sliding just inside the door. It stopped in the rectangle of light. It was brown, brittle, lifeless. And the image of Nadia's grave, 4,000 miles away, blossomed before him, her body entombed in a casket on a wooded hillside, deep in the earth, the freezing silence of winter descending. He thought of her body again, warm in the bed beside him, the white sheets, her tan brown skin, the sin of her body, her breast against his chest, her leg draped over his. Nadia, warm, breathing, sleeping, safe, his. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I do. I want to thank all you guys for coming. But as I mentioned, we have some special guests. And I took a couple of people. Everybody does this. William Faulkner was known for when he was asking if ask any Mississippi writer who's had one or two, and the answer always will involve Faulkner. And it's just in the DNA. And he was asked, are the people in your books, real? Do you base them on your little town of Oxford? And of course he did. The people in Faulkner's novels were known they were very obvious. Phil Stone, his lawyer, was Gavin Stevens in his book. Benji Compson, the idiot, and The Sound and the Fury, was his first grade teacher's big brother, had a mental deficiency. So there were people when I was writing this book that I started with as an idea, right? And then what Faulkner would say is I take real people and I mash them up. He would do this. And so one of the people who did God's work in the U.S. Attorney's Office for about 25 years, who really did put the bad guys in jail, who is just the basis, don't get carried away, but is the basis for Eva Harris is sitting in the front row, and this is June Jeffries. And June and I really, I did have a lunch or two with June at Stoney's, and there's an inside joke to June that Sully eats part of her grilled cheese sandwich, and June would always order defensively at Stoney's and just get the grilled cheese. Uh, I never had the temerity to reach over and get June's sandwich. I would have wound up looking like this, I think, if I had. But Eva isn't June, and June isn't Eva, but that was the basis from which I started. Um, there is a pair of sisters in the group. Noelle has a sister, Lorena, who takes over looking for her when she's gone. They are from a tiny little town in Jamaica, in Manchester Parish. And I base that on my lovely wife, Carol, and her sister, Pearl. And Pearl is over here, and Carol is right there. And Carol, is mom here? Is mom here? She's on with the baby. Okay. Well, I am ticked because never mind all that stuff when I told you all this, that my wonderful mother-in-law, who is the nicest person in the world, you were there, the real bad guy in the book, who's my favorite character, Sly Hastings. It's the drug lord up there in the area. And he has all sorts of lookouts in the neighborhood. And one of them is the very nice Jamaican lady who lives next door, across the street. And I, as a huge giggle fit to myself, turned my entirely nice, endearing, church-going, God-fearing mother-in-law, and to change nothing, I just happened to make her the lookout for the worst drug lord in D.C. Which was a tremendous amount of fun. And she pulls a knife in this book. She hasn't pulled a knife in this on me yet, but I stress yet. And she's happy to tell me I got no manners. I've got no manners. Anyway, if anybody has any questions, I will be happy to enter. Also, I'm forgetting to. If anybody's interested in more, there's more in this book. You can read the story that these things are based on some form of social media. If you look for something Neely Tucker, I'm a very creative guy. It's like neelytucker.com, @NeelyTucker. You may notice a theme here. You can find me. And if anybody has questions or threatened lawsuits, I'd be happy to hear about them.
How you doing? My name is Marcus. I'm a filmmaker interested in film noir and thrillers. I really enjoyed your book.
Thanks.
Thank you. One of my favorite parts of the book was the relationship between Sly and Sully.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk about your inspiration for that.
I started with very, very loosely. There was sort of, there were a number of Teflon's defendants in D.C. at the time. And I started with one guy who they never could really quite convict. And I took him as the basis, but then like I said, I changed everything about him, and it wasn't. But what I liked was you had a really smart, kind of charming guy, who was nonetheless. Everybody has, there's the standing joke is that everybody in New York wants to be the richest guy in the room. Everybody in L.A. wants to be the most famous person in the room, and in D.C., everybody wants to be the smartest person in the room. And this infects everybody in the book. It's not stated, but everybody thinks they're smarter than everybody else. And you really want to look out for a guy who can do the Friday New York Times crossword puzzle while watching television, which Sly can do. So that was sort of the basis for that. And I liked, and when you're a foreign correspondent, if you want to know who's killing people, well, you go ask the bad guys because they're the guys with the guns. It's really pretty simple. But here, everybody gets very nervous about talking to the bad guys for whatever reason. Sully, who has just come back from abroad, doesn't have that. He just interprets Sly and other people like him as if these are small-time warlords. And he's dealt with warlords over there, and Sly Hastings is by no means the most frightening person he's ever dealt with. So Sully is when it comes time for them to talk to each other, he's not at all frightened of Sly. Maybe he should be, but he's not.
I noticed that one of the two people you dedicated this book to is one of my all-time favorite authors, Elmore Leonard, and I was wondering if you could talk about anything that how he influenced you, and maybe what your favorite novel of his is.
Elmore was one of just the nicest people who has ever lived, and one of the most talented, as far as I know. But when I moved to Detroit, I've been living in Miami, and I moved to Detroit with Native Intelligence in late November of one year, which means I froze for the next bit. And when I moved up there, I had two goals. I wanted to meet Anita Baker, R&B singer, and I wanted to meet Elmore Leonard. Well, I saw Miss Baker once at about 8:30 in the morning in the Farmer Jack out in Grosse Pointe, and wearing sweats and looking like she did not want to be bothered. And that is the closest I got to Anita Baker. But I wound up doing a profile. You know, it's if you're gonna work a scam, then work it. And that's why I came there. So I proposed to my boss, said, why don't we do a magazine story on a guide to Detroit through the novels of Elmore Leonard? Well, I would be forced then to call it work to read all of the Detroit novels of Dutch, and I'd have to go meet the man. And it turns out Dutch was just the nicest guy, and we wound up being friends over 20-something years. And Dutch did what I would call this left-handed, sort of thing that, one-handed clapping, right? There's a lot of empty space. If you look at Dutch's books, there's, lots of empty space on the page, and it looks easy until you try to do it. And I profiled him twice, once there and once for the Post. And I never got anybody, myself or anybody else, to explain how this guy who looked like an accountant, was very soft-spoken, lived in the equivalent of Bloomfield Hills is what? Potomac to D.C., McLean. And this guy lived out here who could write the best damn street dialogue that anybody could write. Nobody knows I did that. That was just but he had a very prosaic approach to how to do things. He didn't have highfalutin. His eyes didn't roll back in his head. Well, the creative process. He said I get started working at about 8 and I finish at about 5. And I write about 2 pages a day. I start on this little yellow legal pad, then I type it up, and I write a book in about 5 months. What? And that was, he was just that simple. It was just how good he was at doing that. And I loved his dialogue. I loved his that whole approach to taking a creative endeavor and making it taking all the frightening stuff out of it. So obviously the people that you most love, you emulate, right? And so that's just sort of natural. For me in doing this, his best book, Dutch's books are kind of like Duke Ellington records. There's not a bad one, right? You can just drop the needle on any Duke record, and it's pretty damn good. Some of them are better than others, and if I had to pick a Dutch book that was a Unknown Man 89, City Primeval, Get Shorty, the one that really blew up, is a terrific book. And Dutch had the idea, the other thing that nobody recognizes the influence he has now, because the other one is sort of that. Pulp Fiction is by Quentin Tarantino is the best Elmore Leonard novel or movie not made by Elmore Leonard, because everything you're seeing in that movie is directly down a vein from Dutch. There's no way you would have that movie, or Quentin Tarantino would not have his career, because Dutch's thing is like, okay, 2 guys break in and they're robbing a house. This is scary, right? There's 2 guys upstairs. Most people write that as drama, except in Dutch's books, somebody has left the TV on upstairs and Jeopardy is on. And there's a question, I'll take Egyptian tombs for 600, Alex. And the answer is, what is the largest pyramid? And somebody says, well, is it Cheops? And the other guy goes, no, it's not. And the 2 guys robbing the house get an argument about the $600 question on Jeopardy. That's Dutch. The bad guys don't know that they're bad in Dutch's books. And that's something, again, that I thought that really changed how people write this kind of fiction, that I just thought was great.
Why did you choose 1999 as the year newspapers followed up?
I like the fin de siècle, the end of the century stuff. I would have said it in 1998 today, but there was more Clinton stuff going on then. And while I was happy fudging some stuff in the book, that was too much to fudge, right? So I wanted it sort of just past that. And I wanted it enough room before 9/11, because that's when a lot of irony and, that's just seemed a real another chapter change. By then, things had changed. And that just was a pretty good point, I thought, and it also sort of tied in when these murders were taking place. I moved things around a little bit, but it also kind of tied into that period in D.C. when the police office had some real problems. The coroner's office was in disarray. One of the things that you'll read in the book that is true, that one of the women's bodies that one of the women that went missing, her body was found as a torso in a trash bag in an alley about 8 or 9 blocks from where she lived. And the D.C. coroner's office said, that was an undetermined cause of death. As if she might have cut her throat, cut her legs off, and cut her arms off, and then got herself in a trash bag and then ran over there to the alley, but you couldn't say it was a homicide. That's one reason why they had, so much problems with this. So I wanted enough of that atmosphere when that was really happening to be true, and certainly, and that just seemed like the sweet spot right there. Senor?
Where do you take Sully next? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll repeat it back for him. Just holler out now. Where? I'm sorry. Where
Where
does?
do you take him next?
Well, the next book is already written. He said in advertising. It's an article of faith. Not that I haven't asked my editor is in this room, and you can ask her if when Neely says it's finished, is it actually finished? No, it's not finished until somebody comes over and give it. But it's roughly speaking, the working title is The Well of Time. It's another rough story set in D.C. and in Southwest, which is another forgotten about part of town. And I liked on the waterfront there, things happening. And I fictionalized, D.C. it's about the legacy of slavery and violence in D.C. and how that still pervades. And D.C. had slave pens, as they were known. They really did, just down the Capitol. There was a couple of them, and then just across the river in Alexandria. If you guys saw 12 Years a Slave, I nearly broke my wife's ribs watching that movie, because when they were abducting the guy there, that's the place I'm talking about. So for my purposes, I sort of moved Armfield and Strong. I sort of gave them a branch office over on the D.C. side, and I created this little knob of land that doesn't really exist, but it's right north of Fort McNair, where the Titanic statue is, if any of you know where this is, just down from the Gangplank Marina. And this is a little knob that pokes out there, and it is known as Frenchman's Bend, which is a shout-out for you Faulkner freaks in the audience. Again, you ask somebody from Mississippi to talk about writing for 3 minutes, and you get Faulkner. So that is book 2. So Sully and book 2 will be more or less. There's I can't get into plot spoilers, but he had some unfinished business from book 1 that goes into book 2. And book 1 is again based on like this, on a true story about a mom and her son who wound up dead. Basically, it's light and happiness is some of this should be funny in the book as well, right? It's very grim material, but some of the stuff in the office, particularly between Sully and his editors, there's the newsroom sort of gallows humor. Anybody else?
Did you talk to, in preparing to write the book, did you talk to detectives or police officers to get their take and insights on cases like this, or the Princeton police case?
I did a little bit, and this is Ruben, whose book is going to be out in a week and a half, which is where stuff really happened. It's called S Street Rising, and Ruben did a lot of the reporting that I didn't, but Sully pretends to have done. Yeah, I talked to Danny Whalen a lot. In my guys and in his guys as an off-the-record guy, not in his. Danny Whalen was the cop. He's one of D.C.'s best that they finally put on this case to solve it. And I asked him some stuff about the case. Mainly about what I wanted to ask him was, what plausible way could a reporter get ahead of you guys? How would that, it's nice to, sort of put, but is there a realistic way? We don't have subpoena power, right? And so you're always there at the forbearance of others, right? And if you know they're lying to you, you can't slap them in jail, you can't smack them around, you can't say we're going to haul you downtown on your warrants, your child support. Reporters don't get to do all that stuff. So, and those are often the people who knows what you want to know. So that was one thing, a series of things that I asked him, and basically he said, in this particular case, that we weren't looking. There were a lot of women that were missing. They didn't even come over to the homicide branch. So he said, if your guy has an idea that some of the women that are missing, that would be a very easy way for him to get ahead. And in this particular case, and some of that, I asked him a bunch of other stuff, that wound up. I remember asking, what's the first thing you fill out paperwork-wise when you go to a homicide scene, right? There's a PD 1099. There's an event, report. But is that what you fill out, right? When you go to a homicide, you go back to the office, somebody's dead, and then you go back to the office. You got to do paperwork. What is that paperwork? And it turns out I didn't need it in this thing. But that I would ask him that kind of stuff. And he was very patient. But, Danny, that's you? I have talked to Danny. Ladies and gentlemen, the guy who solved the Princeton Play stuff, Danny Whalen. We have spoken over the phone. So if Danny's going to come beat me up here later, y'all just, So there, see there, Lynn, see, Neely's accurate. Anyway, if there's one more, I feel like a pastor of it. Is there one? Come now, these. Okay, well, look, I'll be happy to sign anything you guys need me to sign.